They didn't yell at her. They didn't insult her. They didn't push her aside in a way anyone could openly accuse. They did something far quieter and far more dangerous. They stopped noticing her. And then they acted like that absence meant nothing. That's how dignity is taken without anyone feeling guilty. That's how harm survives without being called harm. And that's how an entire family convinces itself nothing has changed, while one person slowly disappears in plain sight. Neglect rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with arguments or raised voices, and it almost never introduces itself as harm. More often, it slips in quietly, wearing the language of practicality and efficiency. It survives because it is unnamed. What goes unnoticed is not always unseen, sometimes it is simply unspoken, allowed to exist because acknowledging it would disrupt the calm everyone has agreed to protect. That is how absence can exist in plain sight, and how something important can slowly be set aside without anyone admitting it happened. Eleanor Brooks was still there. She had not disappeared, retreated, or withdrawn from the world. She woke at the same hour each morning, moved through her home with familiar rhythms, and carried herself with the composure that had defined her for decades. From the outside, nothing appeared diminished. Yet her role within the household had begun to change in ways so subtle they were easy to overlook. She was present, but no longer central. Included, but less often consulted. Her voice still existed, but it traveled a shorter distance than it once had. Margaret Brooks believed deeply in order. She managed her life with care, intention, and a steady belief that smooth systems were a form of kindness. To her, chaos was more dangerous than discomfort, and efficiency was a way to protect everyone involved. She loved her mother without question and acted from a place she understood as responsibility. Her decisions were thoughtful, her tone calm, her intentions clean. Nothing she did felt cruel, especially to her. Daily life moved forward with an ease that suggested stability. Meals were planned, appointments kept, routines followed. Conversations were polite and measured, filled with updates about schedules and obligations. There was laughter when appropriate, quiet understanding when needed. The household appeared respectable and well-managed, the kind of environment people admired for its lack of conflict. Nothing about it demanded intervention. The dismissals were small. Almost invisible. A decision made before Eleanor could offer input. A preference summarized instead of asked. A conversation redirected gently when it lingered too long. These moments were framed as practical, even considerate. After all, it was easier this way. Faster. Less complicated. Each choice seemed reasonable on its own, too minor to challenge without appearing sensitive or difficult. Polite smiles filled the gaps where deeper conversations might have lived. Calm tones smoothed over transitions. Surface-level concern replaced curiosity. When Eleanor hesitated, someone finished the thought for her. When she paused, someone moved on. No one intended harm. That was the most convincing part. The absence of malice made the pattern harder to see, easier to accept. There was no villain in the room. No one to point to or accuse. Only a system of behavior that rewarded momentum over reflection. Silence was interpreted as agreement. Adaptation was mistaken for acceptance. Eleanor learned, without anyone telling her directly, which moments required restraint. She adjusted herself quietly, reducing friction by occupying less space. It looked like grace. It felt like containment. Something felt off, but it never reached language. The discomfort lived in pauses, in the way Eleanor measured her words more carefully than before. It existed in the subtle recalibration of her presence, the way she leaned back slightly instead of forward, the way she waited for cues that once came naturally. These changes were small enough to escape notice, yet consistent enough to matter. From a distance, the arrangement worked. The household functioned. Plans were executed. Everyone appeared cared for. The very smoothness of the system protected it from scrutiny. When nothing breaks, no one thinks to ask what might be bending. Emotional distance was mistaken for peace. Quiet was interpreted as resolution. Eleanor did not protest. She had lived long enough to know that naming discomfort often transfers the burden to the person who feels it. Instead, she adapted with patience shaped by years of experience. Her dignity remained intact, but it carried a new weight. The effort required to maintain harmony increased, even as acknowledgement decreased. Margaret continued believing she was doing the right thing. Her efficiency was sincere, her concern real. She did not see the gradual sidelining as loss. To her, it was adjustment. She trusted that if something truly mattered, it would surface. What she did not recognize was how easily important things can be trained not to surface at all. The camera, if there had been one, would not have focused on Eleanor. It would have captured the smoothness of the day, the absence of conflict, the sense that everything was under control. That is how neglect hides best, inside systems that appear successful. It leaves no evidence dramatic enough to demand attention. Yet within this quiet, something irreversible was forming. A pattern had begun, reinforced by repetition and rewarded by ease. Each unchallenged moment strengthened it. The longer it went unnamed, the more normal it felt. Normality is powerful. It convinces people that nothing needs to change. Someone else was present in the house. Someone younger. Someone without the same investment in preserving efficiency or appearances. This presence did not interrupt or object. There was no reaction to point to, no scene to remember. They watched. They noticed the timing, the adjustments, the subtle shifts that adults explained away without explanation. While others moved on, this observer held the moment still. Not with judgment, but with attention. The kind of attention that does not need permission. The kind that lingers even when everyone else has agreed to forget. Someone in the house noticed the pattern, and said nothing. Control rarely presents itself as dominance. More often, it wears the appearance of responsibility. It uses calm language, steady routines, and the promise of efficiency to justify its presence. When control is framed as care, it becomes difficult to question without seeming ungrateful or unreasonable. That is how systems form quietly, not through force, but through repetition that feels helpful on the surface and unquestionable over time. Margaret began making decisions gradually, not with a declaration, but with momentum. She took initiative where hesitation once lived. She organized schedules, coordinated appointments, and streamlined daily life in ways that appeared thoughtful and considerate. These actions were praised. They made things easier. They reduced friction. They allowed the household to function without pause. No one asked her to slow down, because nothing appeared broken. Conversation began to give way to routine. Discussions that once unfolded organically were replaced by summaries delivered with confidence. Plans were announced rather than shaped together. The assumption behind this shift was simple: efficiency saved time, and saving time was a form of kindness. It prevented confusion. It avoided stress. It kept everything moving forward. In that logic, consultation became optional. Eleanor's preferences were no longer asked directly. They were interpreted. Someone explained what she would want or what would be best for her, often before she had a chance to speak. These interpretations were rarely inaccurate enough to cause concern. That was part of the system's strength. It didn't erase her entirely. It reduced her involvement just enough to feel manageable. Just enough to be defended as helpful. The language that supported this shift was gentle and familiar. It's easier this way. She's fine. We don't need to overthink it. These phrases smoothed transitions and closed conversations without confrontation. They suggested that care had already been considered and resolved. To push further would seem unnecessary, even disruptive. Language became a tool not for dialogue, but for containment. Medical updates followed the same pattern. Information was filtered and simplified, shared in ways that prioritized reassurance over understanding. Details that might invite questions were softened. Decisions were framed as conclusions rather than processes. The goal was comfort, not clarity. Eleanor was kept informed enough to feel included, but not engaged enough to influence outcomes. The distinction was subtle, but it mattered. Paperwork moved quietly through the system. Forms were completed, signatures managed, documents filed without ceremony. Transparency was not intentionally withheld, it was simply deemed inefficient. Explaining every step would slow things down. Trust was assumed to replace participation. The system relied on the belief that intentions were good, and good intentions were enough. Emotional restraint became a virtue within this environment. Calm acceptance was praised as maturity. Adaptation was admired. Eleanor's willingness to go along without resistance was interpreted as evidence that everything was working. Her silence reassured others that no boundaries were being crossed. The less she questioned, the more stable the system appeared. Questions, when they surfaced, were gently redirected. Not dismissed outright, but softened until they lost urgency. A change of subject. A reminder of how busy things were. An assurance that everything was handled. These responses were polite, effective, and consistent. Over time, they trained the household to avoid inquiry altogether. Silence was rewarded with smooth days. On the surface, the system felt kind. There was no hostility, no raised voices, no visible distress. Care was visible in organization, in planning, in the absence of chaos. It was easy to believe that this was what responsibility looked like. That belief made the system durable. It protected itself by appearing successful. Eleanor adapted quietly. She had learned that resisting systems framed as care often results in isolation rather than understanding. Instead, she adjusted her expectations. She listened more than she spoke. She accepted summaries in place of conversations. Her dignity remained intact, but it became increasingly internal. The effort to remain agreeable grew, even as her influence diminished. Margaret did not see this as loss. She saw it as progress. From her perspective, things were running smoothly. There were fewer complications, fewer misunderstandings. Her actions were validated by results. The household functioned. Needs were met. She believed that if something truly mattered, Eleanor would say so. What she did not account for was how systems teach people when not to speak. The system's success depended on repetition. Each unchallenged decision reinforced the next. Each smooth outcome justified the method. Over time, the distinction between care and control blurred. What began as assistance became assumption. What began as efficiency became authority. Not because anyone demanded it, but because no one interrupted it. From the outside, there was nothing to criticize. The household appeared organized and calm. There were no obvious signs of neglect. The very absence of conflict served as proof that the system was healthy. This is how control framed as care avoids scrutiny. It produces results that look good enough to prevent questions. Eleanor's emotional restraint continued to be praised. Her ability to adapt was seen as strength. No one noticed how much energy that adaptation required. No one measured the cost of always being accommodated rather than consulted. The system did not account for what it took to maintain harmony without participation. Someone else noticed. Someone younger. Someone who had not yet learned to equate efficiency with kindness. This observer did not challenge the system or ask questions. They watched. They noticed patterns. They saw how decisions always moved in one direction, how care consistently flowed toward control rather than collaboration. They noticed that reassurance replaced understanding, and silence replaced consent. This awareness did not surface immediately. It settled quietly, forming an internal record. The child did not yet have the language to name what they were seeing. They only recognized repetition. Who decided? Who adjusted? Who remained quiet? Patterns, once seen, are difficult to unsee. The system continued functioning smoothly. Margaret remained confident in her role. Eleanor remained composed. Silence remained rewarded. From within, everything felt stable. From one quiet vantage point, something else was becoming clear. A child noticed that care always moved in one direction. Children often notice what adults learn to ignore. They do not analyze behavior through intention or justification. They register it through rhythm, tone, and timing. While adults move forward, explaining transitions to themselves as necessary or inevitable, children remain still long enough to observe what changes and what quietly disappears. That difference in attention is where understanding begins. Caleb Brooks had always been quiet. Not withdrawn, not timid, just observant in a way that allowed moments to unfold fully before he reacted. He listened longer than most people realized. He watched faces rather than words. In a house where efficiency guided conversation, his silence allowed him to notice details that never made it into explanation. He began noticing shifts he could not yet name. The way Eleanor adjusted her posture before speaking, as if gauging whether her contribution would be welcome. The way her sentences shortened over time, moving from complete thoughts to careful fragments. Caleb did not know when this change began. He only knew that it was now consistent enough to feel intentional. Timing told him more than content ever could. Eleanor spoke later in conversations than she once had, often after decisions were already forming. When she did speak, it was with a tone that suggested caution rather than confidence. Caleb noticed how frequently her words were followed by reassurance rather than response. Not disagreement. Not agreement. Reassurance. As if the goal was to smooth rather than engage. Her presence began to occupy less space in rooms she had once anchored. She sat back instead of leaning in. She waited instead of initiating. Caleb noticed how others filled pauses that once belonged to her. These changes were not dramatic. They were practiced. Smooth enough to pass unnoticed by those invested in keeping things moving. Smiles arrived late now. Eleanor still smiled often, but Caleb saw the delay. The fraction of a second where her eyes assessed the room before her expression followed. These smiles did not open conversation. They closed it. They reassured others that nothing needed to be addressed. Caleb recognized this pattern instinctively, even if he could not explain it. There were no confrontations to remember. No raised voices. No tears that demanded attention. That absence made the changes harder to challenge. Without scenes, there were no reference points. Without conflict, there was nothing to resolve. Everything appeared calm, which made the underlying shift feel invisible. Caleb did not respond outwardly to what he noticed. He did not ask questions or express concern. He understood, without being told, that doing so would introduce discomfort no one seemed prepared to hold. Instead, he stored what he observed. Memory began forming not as narrative, but as record. He recorded moments, not explanations. Eleanor hesitating before answering a question. A decision announced without pause. A conversation redirected just as it approached something undefined. These moments accumulated quietly, forming an internal archive that required no interpretation to feel significant. Concern expressed itself through silence rather than reaction. Caleb's attention lingered where others moved on. He noticed how often reassurance replaced inquiry, how frequently care was delivered as conclusion rather than conversation. He felt the imbalance without assigning blame. Patterns, after all, do not need intent to exist. Adults moved forward efficiently. Schedules filled. Routines tightened. Life appeared organized and functional. Caleb remained present for what lingered after those transitions. He noticed how silence settled into rooms, how Eleanor's quiet grew heavier rather than lighter. These impressions stayed with him, not as worry, but as awareness. Eleanor never explained herself to him. She did not articulate loss or frustration. Her restraint remained consistent, and Caleb respected it instinctively. He sensed that asking for clarity would not bring answers, only discomfort. So he waited. Waiting allowed him to see more. Margaret continued managing the household with confidence. Her actions remained calm, her intentions steady. Caleb saw her care and did not question it. He also saw its limits. He recognized that her efficiency depended on momentum, and momentum often required things to be left unexamined. Caleb internalized these observations without judgment. He did not frame them as right or wrong. He framed them as real. Reality, he learned, often lives beneath explanation. What is not said can carry more meaning than what is repeated confidently. The house continued to function smoothly. Days passed without incident. To anyone passing through briefly, nothing appeared unusual. But Caleb was not passing through. He was present long enough to feel the weight of what was being adjusted quietly. He did not yet know what these memories would become. He did not know why they felt important. He only knew they remained. They settled into him, forming an awareness that did not demand action but refused erasure. This awareness was patient. It waited. As Caleb grew older, the archive grew with him. New experiences gave context to old observations. He began recognizing similar patterns elsewhere. The same language of dismissal. The same reward for silence. These connections did not alarm him. They clarified. What he carried was not resentment or sadness. It was recognition. The understanding that attention itself is a form of care, and its absence leaves traces even when everything appears fine. This understanding did not rush him toward confrontation. It prepared him for clarity. Eleanor continued adapting with grace. Her dignity remained intact, though increasingly internal. Caleb saw the effort required to maintain harmony without participation. He understood that endurance can look like acceptance from the outside, even when it is not. Time passed. Life moved forward. The household remained orderly. Caleb remained observant. The moments he recorded did not fade. They matured. They waited for the right context to be understood fully. Years later, those moments would return with clarity. Time continued doing what it always does. Days moved forward without interruption, folding one routine into the next. Birthdays arrived, seasons changed, and milestones were acknowledged with the same polite efficiency that governed everything else. From the outside, it looked like progress. The family believed the moment had passed, handled simply by not being revisited. In their minds, what no longer disrupted daily life no longer required attention. Silence became proof that the issue was over. Eleanor's presence remained steady but subtly altered. She was still there for gatherings, still included in schedules, still spoken about with warmth. Yet her role shifted further from participation toward acknowledgement. Invitations arrived framed as information rather than opportunity. Plans were shared once they were finalized, not while they were forming. Her inclusion became symbolic rather than functional, visible but limited. No one announced this change. It developed through repetition. A meeting she was told about afterward. A decision explained as already settled. These moments stacked quietly, forming a pattern that did not require intention to persist. Each instance reinforced the next until the adjustment felt natural. Familiar. Almost invisible. The family assumed this was resolution. The absence of tension suggested closure. Calm days were interpreted as success. Eleanor's lack of objection reassured everyone that nothing important had been lost. Her composure was mistaken for comfort. Her patience was mistaken for agreement. Silence shifted from response to expectation. It became the default state. Questions felt unnecessary, even intrusive. Over time, the household learned not just when to avoid certain topics, but that avoiding them altogether was preferable. The rhythm of life adapted around this understanding. Conversations shortened. Decisions accelerated. Everything appeared smoother. Caleb grew older within this environment, carrying the quiet archive he had built as a child. With age came context. The moments he had once observed without interpretation began to connect. He started to recognize repetition as structure rather than coincidence. Patterns, once seen clearly, became difficult to dismiss. His perspective deepened not through confrontation, but through distance. As he matured, he saw how often calm was preserved by omission. How efficiency could quietly replace inclusion. He recognized that what was framed as kindness often depended on someone else absorbing the cost without complaint. Eleanor's presence continued to recede, not dramatically, but incrementally. She spoke less in group settings. When she did speak, her words were often followed by reassurance rather than engagement. Caleb noticed how often others stepped in to clarify, summarize, or redirect, as if her contribution needed managing. These adjustments were subtle, practiced, and consistent. Emotional distance was mistaken for peace. The lack of visible conflict allowed everyone to believe the system was healthy. No one asked whether harmony had been achieved through understanding or through containment. The distinction mattered, but it remained unexamined. Timing became critical in Caleb's awareness. He began to understand that some moments lose their power if addressed too early and become more complex if addressed too late. The family had relied on time as a solution, trusting that distance would erase discomfort. What time had actually done was solidify habits. Unresolved things did not fade. They hardened. Eleanor continued adapting with grace. She did not protest or seek recognition. Her dignity remained intact, but increasingly internal. Caleb recognized the effort required to maintain harmony in a system that rewarded silence. He saw how endurance could be mistaken for ease when it was anything but. Margaret remained confident that everything had been handled. The household functioned. Needs were met. She believed the past no longer required attention because it no longer surfaced. What she did not recognize was how systems teach people when not to speak. Silence, once learned, becomes self-sustaining. The family's routines reinforced this belief. Holidays were planned efficiently. Conversations stayed within safe boundaries. Emotional depth was replaced by updates and logistics. The smoothness of it all protected the pattern from scrutiny. When nothing appears broken, no one thinks to ask what has been reshaped. Caleb began to notice how often reassurance replaced curiosity. How quickly conversations moved past moments that deserved pause. He saw how Eleanor's quiet was interpreted as comfort rather than effort. These realizations did not provoke anger. They produced clarity. Time continued passing, but the meaning of the original moment did not diminish. It transformed. What had once been a brief dismissal became a reference point, quietly influencing behavior long after the memory itself had faded for others. The pattern had outlived the moment that created it. Eleanor's dignity was not openly challenged. It was gradually negotiated away through convenience. That distinction mattered. It explained why no one felt responsible. There had been no argument to regret, no harsh words to apologize for. Only a steady accumulation of small decisions that favored efficiency over inclusion. Caleb understood now that silence was not neutral. It shaped outcomes. It determined whose voice carried weight and whose adjusted. The longer the pattern persisted, the harder it became to question without disrupting the peace everyone depended on. He did not act yet. Awareness alone did not demand action. It demanded patience. Caleb understood that recognition was the first step, not the final one. The timing would matter. The context would matter. For now, observation continued. The household moved forward, convinced that the past was settled. Life appeared orderly, respectful, complete. Beneath that order, a structure had formed that no longer required conscious reinforcement. It functioned automatically, shaping interactions without explanation. Caleb saw this clearly now. The moment that had once been dismissed had not ended. It had simply changed form. It lived on in habits, expectations, and silence. Time had not resolved it. Time had preserved it. He realized, with quiet certainty, that the moment had never actually ended. Caleb Brooks returned to the past without announcing his reasons, the way someone does when they are not seeking conflict, only coherence. He did not frame his curiosity as concern or suspicion. He framed it as reflection, a natural extension of growing older and wanting to understand the systems that shaped his childhood. Distance had softened the emotional charge, but it had sharpened his clarity. What once felt vague now felt patterned, and patterns, he knew, deserved attention. He began quietly, revisiting routines rather than memories. He looked at how days had been structured, how decisions were made, how information flowed through the household. He paid attention to what had been consistent rather than what had been dramatic. Nothing stood out on its own. That was the point. The strength of the system had always been its subtlety. It relied on repetition, not force. Caleb reviewed calendars stored in drawers, old planners with neat handwriting, medical appointment cards tucked into envelopes, reminders written and rewritten. He noticed how Eleanor's commitments slowly shifted from active participation to passive attendance. Meetings she once helped plan became events she was informed about. Appointments she once scheduled herself were arranged for her. The transitions were gradual, almost generous in appearance. Each change could be justified. Together, they told a story no one had narrated. He looked at notes left on the kitchen counter, messages passed along verbally, decisions made on her behalf. The language was careful. Never dismissive outright. Words like easier, simpler, handled appeared frequently. They did not accuse. They explained. Caleb recognized how often explanation replaces consent when efficiency becomes the priority. What mattered to him was not why these decisions were made, but how often. Intent was impossible to prove and easy to defend. Structure was not. Structure revealed itself through alignment. And the alignment, once visible, was unmistakable. Each adjustment moved in the same direction. Authority consolidated. Conversation shortened. Eleanor's role narrowed without ever being formally reduced. Caleb did not confront anyone with these observations. He asked indirect questions instead, the kind that sound harmless if you are not listening closely. He asked when certain routines had changed, who usually decided specific matters, how information was typically shared. His tone was neutral, his curiosity measured. He did not challenge motives. He asked about process. The responses were familiar. Calm. Efficient. Slightly evasive. It just made sense. It happened gradually. She didn't mind. No one expressed anger or defensiveness. There was no sense of accusation to react against. Avoidance appeared instead, gentle and practiced. Conversations redirected themselves naturally, the same way they always had. What struck Caleb was how consistently his questions were answered with outcomes rather than explanations. What had been done was clear. Why it had been done remained abstract. This abstraction protected everyone involved. It allowed the family to maintain the belief that nothing harmful had occurred because nothing harmful had been intended. Caleb understood this logic. He also saw its limits. Documentation filled in what conversation softened. Dates aligned. Notes corroborated habits. Patterns repeated. The system had been internally consistent for years. That consistency was its most telling feature. It demonstrated not malice, but momentum. Once the structure was established, it sustained itself without requiring active reinforcement. Silence did the work. Caleb noticed how Eleanor's preferences appeared in summaries rather than in her own words. She likes this. She doesn't mind that. Her voice was represented, not consulted. This representation was accepted as accurate because it had gone unchallenged for so long. Accuracy was assumed through familiarity. Caleb wondered when that assumption had replaced verification. Family members responded to his continued curiosity with reassurance rather than engagement. "You're overthinking it. Everything's fine now. That was a long time ago." These phrases functioned as closures, not answers. They marked the boundary of acceptable inquiry. Caleb recognized them as the same language that had once ended conversations before they began. The truth aligned too cleanly to dismiss. Not because it was shocking, but because it was orderly. Every piece fit without strain. The system had not been designed with intention, but it had been maintained with consistency. That consistency carried consequences, regardless of how gently it was enforced. Caleb felt no surge of anger. He felt responsibility. Understanding structure meant understanding impact. The realization did not demand confrontation. It demanded acknowledgement. He saw now that neglect rarely announces itself because it does not need to. It survives through normalization, through the quiet agreement that efficiency is kindness and silence is peace. Eleanor's experience came into focus without needing to be retold. Her adaptation, once interpreted as acceptance, now appeared as endurance. She had navigated the system with patience, not consent. That distinction mattered. It reframed everything Caleb had observed as a child and explained why those moments had stayed with him. He understood that once structure is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. The knowledge settled into him with weight, not urgency. He knew that speaking too quickly would recreate the same imbalance he was trying to address. Timing mattered. Care mattered. The goal was not exposure. It was correction. Caleb allowed the understanding to mature before acting on it. He resisted the urge to translate clarity into confrontation. He knew that systems dissolve slowly, the same way they form. What mattered now was not assigning blame, but restoring balance in ways that would last beyond a single conversation. The family continued as before, unaware that the ground beneath their assumptions had shifted. The system still functioned. The routine still held. But Caleb no longer moved within them unconsciously. His awareness altered his presence, the way awareness always does. What he understood could not remain unacknowledged. Consequences did not arrive in Eleanor Brooks's life with raised voices or dramatic reckonings. They came the way most lasting changes do, quietly, through process rather than personality. There were no family meetings called to address the past, no emotional declarations demanding accountability. Instead, small structural adjustments began to take shape, subtle at first, then unmistakable in their consistency. What had once been handled automatically now paused. What had once been decided privately now required confirmation. The shift was not announced, but it was felt. Margaret did not wake one morning resolved to change. Her intentions had never been cruel, and they did not suddenly transform into repentance. What changed was the framework around her decisions. Systems she had built for efficiency began to expose their limitations. Calendars required shared access. Appointments included explicit invitations rather than assumptions. Paperwork that had once been summarized was now reviewed together. These changes were not emotional gestures. They were procedural corrections, and they altered the balance of power without demanding acknowledgement. Boundaries adjusted themselves through repetition. Eleanor's preferences were no longer inferred. They were asked for. Her silence was no longer interpreted as agreement. It became a signal to pause rather than proceed. This did not happen all at once, nor did it arrive with explanation. It emerged through practice, reinforced each time a decision was slowed just enough to include her voice. Respect, restored this way, did not need to be defended. It became embedded. There were no speeches about dignity. None were necessary. Eleanor did not ask for apologies or retrospection. She accepted the changes as they came, not with triumph, but with steadiness. What mattered to her was not acknowledgement of past exclusion, but the present reality of being considered. Her dignity returned not as a performance, but as a condition of daily life. She moved through the house with the same grace she always had, but the effort required to maintain it had lessened. Authority rebalanced without conflict. Decisions no longer flowed in a single direction. They moved outward, paused, then returned with consensus. This recalibration felt unfamiliar at first, even inefficient. But over time, it proved more stable. The household adjusted its rhythm, discovering that inclusion did not slow progress, it clarified it. What had once felt like control reframed itself as collaboration, and the difference was felt by everyone, even if no one named it. Margaret experienced this shift internally before she articulated it. She began to notice how often she had equated calm with correctness. How easily systems that worked could obscure voices they did not prioritize. This recognition did not arrive with guilt sharp enough to wound. It came with responsibility, quieter and more durable. She learned to listen without feeling that authority was being challenged. She learned that care did not require efficiency to be effective. The family, as a whole, was forced to reassess what they had called normal. Habits that once went unquestioned now revealed their assumptions. Silence no longer meant agreement. It carried weight. It required interpretation. In this new context, quiet was no longer a refuge from discomfort. It became an invitation to ask whether something had been missed. Accountability settled into the spaces where avoidance once lived. Eleanor's restoration did not isolate her. It integrated her. She was not placed on display as someone who had been wronged, nor was she treated with exaggerated deference. Her inclusion was matter-of-fact, consistent, and unremarkable in the best possible way. She was asked because it made sense to ask her. She was included because her presence mattered. Nothing about this required confrontation. Caleb watched all of this unfold without comment. His role had never been to intervene. It had been to observe. Now, he saw the consequences of attention sustained over time. He recognized how systems changed when patterns were acknowledged rather than defended. He understood that justice did not always require exposure or conflict. Sometimes it required patience long enough to allow truth to reshape structure. Silence, in this phase, felt different. It was no longer the absence of discussion, but the presence of understanding. Conversations did not avoid difficult subjects so much as they approached them carefully, without urgency. The family learned that accountability did not have to be loud to be real. It could live in how often someone was consulted, how decisions were framed, how space was shared. Eleanor noticed the difference most in the ordinary moments. In the way plans were made with her rather than around her. In the way her hesitation prompted curiosity instead of replacement. These moments did not feel like victories. They felt like relief. The effort she had once invested in staying unobtrusive could now be redirected towards simply being present. That shift mattered more than any apology could have. Margaret did not articulate this as a lesson learned. She did not need to. Her behavior reflected it. Authority, once centralized, now moved with awareness. Care, once expressed through control, found new expression in listening. The household adjusted without naming what had changed, but everyone felt the difference in how it functioned. The absence of confrontation preserved connection. No one was forced into defensiveness. No one was required to justify themselves against accusation. This allowed the changes to endure. They were not reactions to conflict, but responses to clarity. The system corrected itself because it could no longer ignore what had become visible. Caleb understood, then, that consequences are not always punitive. They are often corrective. They do not arrive to shame, but to realign. What mattered was not who was blamed, but what was changed. The dignity restored to Eleanor did not come at anyone else's expense. It came from the recognition that respect is not finite. It multiplies when shared. Only later did the family begin to realize how long they had been watched. How much attention had been paid in silence. Caleb had never demanded change, never named the pattern aloud. Yet his presence had mattered. His witnessing had mattered. Awareness, once held long enough, has a way of shaping outcomes. Only then did they realize who had been watching all along. Loyalty did not announce itself when it finally became visible. It did not arrive as a declaration, an argument, or a moment of emotional release. It showed up quietly, through repetition. Through presence. Through choices made daily, without expectation of recognition. By the time anyone noticed it, loyalty had already been at work for years, steady and patient, shaping outcomes without drawing attention to itself. Eleanor Brooks' place in the family was reframed not by apology, but by action. No one gathered to explain what had gone wrong or to formally acknowledge what had been missed. Instead, something simpler happened. Decisions began to slow down just enough to include her. Questions were asked directly rather than assumed. Her preferences were no longer summarized or translated by someone else. They were heard as she spoke them. These changes were not dramatic. They were consistent. And consistency, more than words, restored what had been quietly diminished. Nothing about this shift felt performative. There was no attempt to compensate for the past through exaggerated care. Eleanor was not placed at the center as a gesture of correction. She was integrated naturally, the way she had been before adjustments were ever needed. This return to balance mattered because it was not framed as kindness. It was framed as normal. Her dignity did not depend on acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It depended on sustained respect. Caleb Brooks' loyalty became clearest in what he refused to rush. He did not press for emotional reckoning or seek validation for his long patience. He remained present in the same way he always had, attentive without intruding, observant without interrupting. He followed through. He showed up when consistency mattered more than intensity. His restraint ensured that the changes taking place were not reactions, but corrections rooted in understanding. Forgiveness entered the family quietly, without erasing truth. No one pretended the past had been harmless. No one asked Eleanor to absolve what had happened or to confirm that everything was now fine. Forgiveness, in this context, was not about forgetting. It was about refusing to let harm define the future while still acknowledging its reality. The truth remained intact, but it no longer dictated behavior. Guilt surfaced naturally, but it did not dominate. It did not spiral into defensiveness or self-justification. Instead, it transformed into responsibility. Family members began noticing patterns they had once overlooked. They adjusted their behavior not because they were told to, but because they now understood the impact of their habits. Responsibility replaced intention as the measure of care. What mattered was not what they meant to do, but what they consistently did. There were no victory speeches. No moral conclusions drawn aloud. The absence of theatrics preserved the sincerity of the moment. Everyone understood that restoration was not an achievement to celebrate. It was an obligation to maintain. This understanding kept the atmosphere grounded, focused on continuation rather than closure. Eleanor accepted these changes without commentary. She did not revisit the past or seek acknowledgement for her endurance. Her acceptance was not passive. It was discerning. She recognized when actions aligned with respect and allowed herself to occupy space without apology. Her presence felt fuller now, not because it demanded attention, but because it no longer required adjustment to be accommodated. Caleb watched these shifts with a quiet steadiness. His loyalty did not require him to direct outcomes or monitor progress. He trusted what he had helped set in motion. That trust was part of his restraint. He understood that true loyalty steps back once consistency takes hold. It does not hover or supervise. It allows others to carry responsibility themselves. Calm moral clarity settled over the household. Conversations felt less managed, less careful. Silence returned, but its function had changed. It was no longer used to avoid discomfort. It created space for reflection, for thought, for presence. When silence occurred, it did not signal dismissal. It signaled consideration. The family began to understand that loyalty is not proven in moments of confrontation. It is proven in what remains unchanged after attention fades. The daily choices to listen, to include, to pause, these became the new structure. Not because someone enforced them, but because they made sense now. Understanding had altered perception, and perception had altered behavior. Eleanor moved through her days with an ease that did not require explanation. She was no longer navigating around systems designed without her in mind. She was part of them again. This reintegration did not erase the past, but it prevented repetition. That was its value. Caleb's role diminished naturally. Not because his awareness was no longer needed, but because it had done its work. Loyalty, once expressed through watching and waiting, now expressed itself through trust. He trusted that what had been learned would not be forgotten. He trusted that consistency would hold where urgency was no longer required. There was no final acknowledgement, no concluding statement to mark the change. Life continued forward, carrying the adjustments within it. The absence of closure was not a lack. It was a sign of integration. What had shifted no longer needed to be named to exist. Yet beneath this calm, there remained the sense that understanding was still unfolding. Not because something was unresolved, but because awareness had widened. What began as attention to one pattern had expanded into a broader recognition of how easily care can become control, and how quietly dignity can be restored when someone chooses to remain consistent. The final understanding had not yet surfaced. Being unnoticed is often misunderstood as absence. As if what is not acknowledged ceases to exist. But what truly disappears is not what goes unseen, but what goes unwitnessed. Eleanor Brooks had been present the entire time. Her presence never faded. What changed was how often it was actively recognized. And recognition, once withheld long enough, reshapes how a person is held within a system, even when love is never withdrawn. The family's dynamics did not revert once the adjustments settled in. They could not. Awareness, once established, does not quietly retreat. What had been learned altered how choices were made, how conversations unfolded, how silence was interpreted. The household carried forward differently, not because anyone enforced change, but because forgetting was no longer possible. The pattern had been seen. That alone ensured permanence. Eleanor's presence was restored not through ceremony, but through continuity. She was not reintroduced into conversations or decision-making as an act of correction. She was simply there, as she always had been, but now without friction. Her input was neither highlighted nor bypassed. It was assumed. This assumption was the clearest form of respect. It removed the need for vigilance. It allowed her to exist without adjusting herself for ease. Time moved on, but it no longer softened attention. Instead, it reinforced it. Days unfolded without the need to revisit what had changed. The absence of reminders did not signal neglect. It signaled integration. Eleanor's voice was woven back into the structure of daily life so completely that it no longer required protection. That was the quiet victory, though no one named it as such. Caleb Brooks' awareness did not stop at the family's edge. What he had learned extended outward, influencing how he observed other systems, other silences. He noticed how easily people confuse efficiency with care, how often comfort is preserved at the expense of dignity. He recognized patterns more quickly now, not with suspicion, but with discernment. Awareness became a lens he carried with him, shaping how he listened and where he paused. He did not become confrontational or reactive. His understanding did not harden him. It softened him in deliberate ways. He paid attention where others moved quickly. He recognized when silence was thoughtful and when it was evasive. He understood that what matters most often exists in the space people rush past. This understanding did not isolate him. It grounded him. Within the family, reflective stillness replaced management. Silence returned, but its purpose had shifted. It was no longer a tool to avoid discomfort or maintain efficiency. It allowed space for presence. It gave conversations room to finish themselves. It invited consideration without demanding resolution. This stillness felt earned, the result of awareness rather than avoidance. Justice, if it could be called that, was complete in its quiet form. Not because anyone had been held accountable publicly, but because behavior aligned with understanding. Respect was no longer conditional or situational. It was embedded. Eleanor did not need to advocate for herself. The system no longer required correction because it had been corrected. The past was not erased. It was contextualized. The family did not dwell on what had been missed, but they did not dismiss it either. They allowed memory to inform their awareness without anchoring them in regret. This balance preserved forward motion while honoring truth. It ensured that what had been learned would not become theoretical. Eleanor moved through her days with a steadiness that no longer required interpretation. Her presence carried ease. The effort once spent navigating around assumptions had been returned to her as quiet freedom. She did not speak about this change. She lived it. And living it was enough. Caleb observed this with a sense of completion that did not need closure. He understood that being seen is not about attention. It is about witness. Someone holding the moment long enough for it to matter. He had done that once, silently, without knowing why. Now he understood what that attention had protected. The family no longer mistook calm for resolution or silence for agreement. They recognized that what is overlooked does not disappear. It accumulates. And what is witnessed, even quietly, gains endurance. This understanding altered how they noticed one another, how they responded to subtle shifts, how they defined care. There was no celebration. No announcement that something had been restored. The absence of spectacle preserved the integrity of the change. It ensured that dignity was not framed as a gift returned, but as something that had always belonged there. As seasons changed and routines continued, the household carried its awareness forward. Nothing dramatic marked the passage of time. That was the point. What had shifted did not need reinforcement. It had settled into permanence. Being overlooked was never the risk. Being unwitnessed was.